They called her weak, a servant no one noticed, no one respected. But one night, by pure accident, she entered the forbidden chamber of the most feared vampire king, a place where no human was ever meant to survive. And instead of death, she awakened something inside him that had been dead for centuries. A heart that could not feel began to beat again. But her kindness came with a dangerous secret one that could start a war and change the fate of an entire kingdom. If you love emotional, powerful vampire stories with deep romance and shocking twists, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay till the end, because this story will change everything you believe about love and power. Asterisk, the mistake that changed everything. She was just a servant. But one wrong step led her into the vampire king's forbidden chamber. The castle was alive that night, but not in a way that brought comfort. It breathed with whispers, secrets, and fear. Elara Vance moved quietly through the long marble corridors, her head lowered, her hands trembling slightly as she carried a silver tray filled with wine and fruit. She was used to being invisible, used to people passing by her as if she didn't exist. In this palace, she was nothing more than a servant, one of many, easily replaceable, easily ignored. But tonight felt different. There was tension in the air, a strange heaviness that made even the torches flicker as if they were afraid. Earlier that evening, she had been humiliated in front of everyone. One of the noblewomen had spilled wine on her dress and blamed her for it, accusing her of clumsiness. The other servants had stayed silent, too afraid to speak. Elara had simply lowered her gaze and apologized, even though it wasn't her fault. That was her life, enduring, surviving, staying quiet. But deep inside, there was something else too. A quiet strength. A refusal to let cruelty turn her into something bitter. West Wing. Third chamber. Take this and don't make mistakes, the head maid had ordered sharply, shoving the tray into Elara's hands. Elara nodded without question. She always did. The West Wing was forbidden for most servants. It was darker, colder, and strangely silent. The walls seemed older, as if they held memories no one dared to speak about. As she walked, her heartbeat quickened. She had heard stories about the king, about the shadows, about things that lived longer than time itself. But she told herself not to believe in rumors. She had work to do. When she reached the third chamber, she hesitated. The door was slightly open, and a faint glow spilled out into the hallway. No guards, no voices, just silence. She knocked softly, but no one answered. Her fingers tightened around the tray. I should just leave it and go, she whispered to herself. But she didn't. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The room inside was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was vast and elegant, filled with dark velvet curtains, silver candlelight, and a scent of roses that lingered in the air. In the center of the chamber was a bath, already drawn, filled with water and floating petals. It looked peaceful, tempting, and for a moment, Elara forgot where she was. The long day, the humiliation, the exhaustion, it all caught up to her at once. Her body ached, her mind felt heavy, and the warmth of the room wrapped around her like a quiet invitation. She stepped forward, placing the tray on a nearby table, her eyes still fixed on the bath. I'll just rest for a moment, she murmured. It was a mistake. She slipped out of her worn dress and stepped into the water. The warmth immediately surrounded her, soothing every ache, every pain she had carried all day. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing slowed, and for the first time in a long while, she felt safe. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the world disappeared. But when she opened them again, she was no longer alone. A man stood at the doorway, tall, silent, watching. His presence filled the entire room like a storm waiting to break. His pale face was sharp and flawless, his dark hair falling slightly over eyes that glowed with something unnatural, something powerful, ancient, and dangerous. He didn't move. He simply stared at her, as if trying to understand what he was seeing. Elara blinked, confused but not afraid. I didn't know this room was occupied," she said softly, her voice calm despite the strange tension in the air. A man stepped forward slowly. "You are in my chamber," he said, his voice deep, cold, and controlled. Something about the way he spoke made the air feel heavier. Elara tilted her head slightly, studying him. There was something in his eyes, not just power, but loneliness. A quiet pain hidden beneath all that strength. "You don't look angry," she said gently. He froze. No one had ever said that to him before. "You should be afraid of me," he replied. "Why?" she asked, her voice innocent, honest. Silence filled the room. Then, without thinking, without fear, Elara reached out and touched his hand. It was cold, but in that moment, something impossible happened. The vampire King Kale Draven felt warmth, the girl everyone ignored before she met the king. She was invisible, unwanted, and constantly humiliated. The morning after the strange encounter felt unreal, as if the night had been nothing more than a dream Elara was not meant to remember. She woke in her small servant's room, sunlight barely slipping through the cracked window, her body still carrying the warmth of the bath and the memory of those piercing eyes. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined everything: the chamber, the man, the strange feeling that had passed between them. But deep inside, she knew it had been real. Too real to forget. Still, she pushed the thought away, because in her world, survival meant focusing on the present, not on impossible moments. As she stepped back into her daily duties, reality returned quickly and harshly. The castle was no place for kindness. Orders were sharp, voices were cold, and mistakes were never forgiven. Elara worked quietly, moving from one task to another, carrying trays, cleaning floors, washing dishes, all while staying invisible as she always had. The other servants spoke over her, around her, sometimes about her, but rarely to her. To them, she was just the girl who never complained, the one who always said yes. Later that afternoon, trouble found her again. In the grand hall, a group of noble guests had gathered, their laughter loud and careless. Elara had been assigned to serve them drinks, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. As she approached, one of the nobles, a young man with a mocking smile, deliberately extended his foot, causing her to stumble. The tray tilted, and a glass of wine spilled across the polished floor. Silence followed. Then came the laughter. "Clumsy girl," the noble sneered. "Do they hire anyone these days?" Elara's face burned, but she said nothing. She bent down quickly, trying to clean the mess before anyone else could react. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her expression remained calm. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. "I'm sorry," she said softly, though it wasn't her fault. "Of course you are," another voice mocked. "That's all your kind ever says?" The words stung, but Elara swallowed the pain. She finished cleaning, stood up quietly, and stepped back, lowering her gaze. No one defended her. No one ever did. But what they didn't see, what they never cared to notice, was what happened after as the hall slowly emptied. Elara stayed behind. She noticed an older servant struggling to carry a heavy basket of linens, his back bent with age and exhaustion. Without hesitation, she walked over and gently took the basket from his hands. "You should rest," she said kindly. "I'll take this." The man looked at her, surprised. "You've already done enough today." "It's all right," she replied with a small smile. Moments like this defined her, not the humiliation, not the cruelty, but the quiet choices she made when no one was watching. She helped because she wanted to, not because she expected anything in return. What she didn't know was that someone was watching, high above. Hidden within the shadows of a balcony, Cale Draven stood in silence. His sharp gaze followed her every movement, every small act of kindness, every quiet moment of strength. He had not forgotten the girl from his chamber, the one who touched him without fear, the one who made him feel something he thought he had lost forever. But this was something more. She endures, he murmured softly to himself, and still chooses kindness. For the first time in centuries, something stirred within him again, not just curiosity, but something deeper, something dangerous. And as Elara walked away, unaware of the eyes that followed her, her life was already beginning to change, because the girl everyone ignored had been seen by a king. The king who could not feel. The vampire king had everything, except a heart that could feel. Cale Draven stood alone in the highest tower of his castle, looking out over a kingdom that feared him more than it respected him. The night stretched endlessly before him, cold and silent, just as it had been for centuries. He ruled with absolute power, commanded armies without question, and inspired terror with a single glance. Yet none of it filled the emptiness inside him. Long ago, something within him had died, not his body, not his strength, but his ability to feel. No joy, no warmth, no connection. Only control, only darkness. That was the curse he carried, one far heavier than any crown. But now, something was wrong. Or perhaps, something was finally changing. His thoughts returned to her again, as they had countless times since that night. The human girl, Elara, the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with hatred, but with calm curiosity, as if he was not a monster, not a king, but simply a man. It disturbed him in ways he did not understand. No one had ever looked at him like that before. No one had ever touched him without trembling. And yet, she had. He clenched his hand slightly, remembering the moment her fingers brushed against his skin. Warmth had spread through him, real, undeniable warmth. It had startled him so deeply that he had stepped back, almost as if he had been burned. That feeling should not exist. Not for him. Not anymore. Impossible, he muttered under his breath. But even as he said it, he knew it was not. The following days only made things worse. Or better. He could not decide. Without realizing it, he began watching her. At first, it was simple curiosity. A passing glance from the shadows. A quiet observation from a distance. But slowly, it became something else. He found himself seeking her out, tracking her movements through the castle, noticing the smallest details others ignored. The way she spoke gently, even to those who treated her poorly. The way she endured pain without bitterness. The way she helped others without expecting anything in return. It made no sense to him. Humans were weak, selfish, temporary. Yet she was different. She should hate them, he said quietly one evening, watching as she carried heavy supplies alone while others laughed nearby. She should be broken. But she wasn't. Instead, she remained kind. And that unsettled him more than any enemy ever had. One night, unable to ignore the pull any longer, Cale descended from his tower and moved silently through the castle corridors. The guards did not see him. The servants did not notice him. He was a shadow among shadows, a king who walked unseen when he chose to. His steps led him to the lower halls, to the quiet spaces where servants lived and worked. To her. He found her alone in a dimly lit corridor, struggling to lift a heavy container of water. Her hands slipped slightly, her strength nearly failing, but she refused to give up. She took a breath, steadying herself, trying again. For a moment, he simply watched. Then, before she could fall, he stepped forward, The container lifted effortlessly from her hands. Elara froze. Slowly. She looked up. Their eyes met again. This time, there was no confusion. No distance. Just recognition. You, she whispered softly. Kale said nothing. He set the container aside, his gaze never leaving her face. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. And you shouldn't be helping me, she replied. Her voice calm, almost teasing. Something shifted again. A faint, unfamiliar feeling stirred in his chest. Not pain. Not darkness. Something lighter. Something human. And for the first time in centuries, the vampire king did not walk away. Asterisk the secret in her blood. She thought she was ordinary. But her blood carried a hidden truth. The change began quietly, almost too quietly to notice at first, like a whisper hidden beneath the noise of the castle. Elara continued her daily work as she always had, moving through the halls with the same humility and patience. But something around her had shifted. The air felt different when she passed, heavier yet strangely alive, as if the castle itself had started to recognize her presence. She didn't understand it, and no one explained it to her, but deep inside, a feeling she could not name had begun to grow. Kale noticed it immediately. From the moment he had stepped closer to her, from the moment he had allowed himself to remain in her presence longer than he should have, he began to sense something unusual. It was not just her kindness or her resilience anymore. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath her fragile human exterior. Something ancient. One evening, as the castle slept under a silver moon, Kale stood in the shadows of the great hall, watching her again. Elara was tending to a wounded servant, carefully cleaning a cut on his arm with gentle hands. Her voice was soft, reassuring, and despite her own exhaustion, she stayed until the man was calm. It was a simple act, one most would overlook, but Kale saw more. As her fingers brushed against the wound, the bleeding slowed unnaturally fast. The servant blinked in confusion, flexing his arm as if the pain had already faded. How? The man whispered, stunned. Elara simply smiled. You'll be all right. She didn't notice, but Kale did. His eyes narrowed slightly, his expression sharpening as realization began to take shape. He had seen healing before. Magic existed in his world, but this was different. It was pure, natural, almost forgotten. Her blood. He murmured under his breath. The thought sent a ripple of tension through him. If he could sense it. Others would too. And that meant danger. As if the night itself had been listening. The peace did not last long. News spread quickly through the hidden corners of the castle. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors turned into attention. There were those who had been waiting, watching for something like this. Power always attracted enemies, and Elara, without even realizing it, had become something valuable. The next day, everything changed. Elara was called to the upper halls, a place she had never been allowed before. The atmosphere there was colder, more controlled, filled with nobles and advisors whose eyes held suspicion instead of warmth. As she stepped into the chamber, she could feel their gazes on her, studying her like she was no longer just a servant, but something else. Something dangerous. She is the one of them said quietly. The human girl. Elara's heart began to race. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel it. This was not good. Before anyone could say more, the doors opened suddenly. Kale entered. The room fell silent. Instantly, his presence alone commanded it. His gaze moved across the room, cold and sharp, before settling on Elara. For a brief moment, something softer flickered in his eyes, but it disappeared just as quickly. She is under my protection, he said. His voice calm but absolute. The words shocked everyone, even Elara. But your majesty, one advisor began. I said. Kale interrupted, his tone now edged with warning. She is under my protection. No one dared to argue further. Elara stood frozen, her mind struggling to keep up with everything that was happening. She had done nothing, said nothing, and yet somehow her life had shifted once again, this time into something far more dangerous than before. As Kale stepped closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear, he spoke quietly. "You don't understand what you are?" he said. Elara looked up at him, confusion and fear mixing in her eyes. "Then tell me," she whispered. But Kale hesitated, because the truth would change everything. When love becomes war, the castle turned into a battlefield, all because of one human girl. The calm that once filled the castle was gone, replaced by tension that spread like fire through every hall and shadow. Elara could feel it in the way servants whispered when she passed, in the way guards stood more alert than before, and most of all, in the way the nobles watched her with suspicion, fear, and something far more dangerous: greed. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer ignored. Now, she was the center of something she didn't understand, and it terrified her. Kale had moved her to a protected chamber within the inner palace, a place where no servant was allowed and no noble could enter without his command. It was safer, he had said, but safety did not feel like peace. The walls were grand, the room filled with luxury, yet Elara felt more trapped than ever before. She missed the simple quiet of her old life, even with its hardships. At least then, she had known her place. Now, everything was uncertain. "You shouldn't be here," Elara said one night as Kale stood near the window, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside. "This isn't my world." Kale didn't turn to look at her immediately. His expression remained distant, but there was something heavier behind it now, something restless. "It is now," he replied. "That doesn't make it right," she said softly. His jaw tightened slightly. "Right or wrong no longer matters," he said. "You are not safe outside these walls." Elara took a step closer, her voice quieter but stronger. "And what about you?" That made him turn. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Kale stepped toward her. "I have never been safe," he said. There was truth in his voice, something raw and unguarded, and it made Elara's heart ache in a way she didn't expect. He was powerful, feared, untouchable, and yet he carried a loneliness deeper than anything she had ever known. Before she could respond, a sudden noise shattered the silence. The doors burst open. Guards rushed in, their expressions tense. "Your Majesty, there's been an attack." Kale's entire demeanor changed instantly. The softness disappeared, replaced by the cold authority of a king. "Where?" he demanded. "The Eastern Wing. Intruders. They're searching for the girl." The room fell silent. Elara's breath caught. "They came for me?" she whispered. Kale's gaze hardened. Yes, the truth struck her harder than anything else could. She had become a reason for violence, for conflict, for war. People were risking lives, losing lives, because of something she didn't even understand. "I won't let this continue," she said suddenly. Kale looked at her sharply. "You don't have a choice." "I do," she insisted, her voice trembling but determined. "If I leave, they'll stop." "No," he said firmly. "They won't stop. They'll follow. They'll hunt you until there is nothing left. And let them," she whispered. Silence. Something in Kale broke. Before she could move, he stepped forward and grabbed her wrist, not harshly, but firmly enough to stop her. "I will not let you sacrifice yourself," he said, his voice low, filled with something far deeper than command. Elara looked up at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Why?" she asked softly. The question hung between them. For the first time, Kale did not have an immediate answer. "Because the truth was no longer simple, because this was no longer just protection. It was something else, something stronger, something dangerous. His grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. Because, he said quietly, his voice no longer cold, losing you is not something I can endure. Elara's heart stopped for a moment. Outside, the sounds of battle echoed through the castle walls. Inside, something even more powerful had begun. Love had crossed the line from silence into war. The queen no one expected, the girl they once humiliated, now stood beside the vampire king. The war did not last long, but its impact changed everything. By dawn, the castle stood silent again, but it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, filled with the weight of what had been revealed. The attackers had been defeated, but their presence had exposed a truth no one could ignore anymore. Elara was no longer just a human girl. She was something rare, something powerful, something that could shift the balance of an entire kingdom. Elara stood near the grand window of the throne hall, watching the first light of morning spread across the dark lands. Her reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar to her now. She was still the same girl, the same heart, the same kindness, but the way the world saw her had changed completely. The servants who once ignored her now looked at her with respect. The nobles who once mocked her now lowered their eyes in silence. But none of that mattered to her. What happens now? She asked quietly. Behind her, Cale stood at the base of the throne, his presence calm but commanding. He had not slept. The night's battle had left its mark, not just on the kingdom, but on him. Yet his eyes were no longer empty. There was something alive within them now, something that had been missing for centuries. Now, he said slowly, they will accept what they cannot control. Elara turned to face him. And what is that? Cale stepped forward, his gaze steady, unwavering. You. The words settled between them, simple but powerful. Before she could respond, the great doors of the hall opened. The council entered, followed by nobles, guards, and servants. The entire court had gathered, their expressions serious, their movements careful. This was no ordinary meeting. This was something far greater. One of the elder advisors stepped forward. Your Majesty, he began, his voice respectful but tense. The kingdom demands stability. What happened last night cannot be ignored. Cale's expression did not change. It won't be, he replied. The advisor glanced briefly at Elara before continuing. The girl. Her existence will bring conflict. Many will challenge it. Many will not accept her. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Elara felt the weight of their words, but she did not step back. Cale, however, stepped forward. They will, he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. The room fell silent instantly, because this was not just a statement. It was a decision. Cale turned slightly toward Elara, his expression softening just enough for only her to notice. Then, without hesitation, he extended his hand toward her. A simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything. Elara hesitated for only a second. Then she placed her hand in his. The moment she did, something shifted not just in the room, but in the very air itself. The fear, the doubt, the resistance, it all faded beneath something stronger. Acceptance. Cale turned back to the court, his voice clear and undeniable. She is not a threat, he declared. She is the future of this kingdom. No one argued. No one dared to, because for the first time, they saw not just their king, but a man who had chosen. And beside him, they saw not a servant, not a weak girl, but a queen. Elara stood tall, her heart steady, her fear gone. She had not become powerful through strength or force, but through something far greater: kindness, resilience, and the courage to remain herself in a world that tried to break her. She had been invisible, She had been humiliated. She had been underestimated. And now she was unstoppable. Dot, as Cale stood beside her, his hand still holding hers. He felt something he had not felt in centuries. Peace, not because the war was over, but because he was no longer alone. And in that moment, the entire kingdom learned a truth they would never forget. Respect is not given by power. It is earned through the heart.